Welcome, everybody. My name is Anton Treuer, and I've met many of you before when I was at CDH giving a presentation to the Student Assembly. I'm a professor at Bemidji State University, and I'm really happy to see you all here today. I sometimes use an analogy when talking about things like race and other sometimes difficult topics, where I might hold up my finger and say, "What is this?" And unless we have a shared understanding, even something like that could start an argument. Because in the language of body parts, well, indeed, that's a finger. But in the language of numbers, it's a one. And in the language of space, that's up. So who's right? And the answer is they're all right. It just depends on perspective. So oftentimes when we talk about difficult topics, someone's up there saying this here's a finger, it's not an elbow, it's not a toe. Everybody else, shh. And someone's listening going, that's a one, not a two, not a three. See, they just don't understand. And we miss each other. So it's really, really powerful if we can engage multiple perspectives and see that as a finger and one and up and all the many other things that it can mean in different cultures. And that puts us in a position that's really powerful to understand other people and to advocate for change. I think too, in this day and age, a lot of people are a little nervous about cultural change. Politics has been a testy topic. But one of the things I'd like to share with you is that, equal rights for other people doesn't mean less rights for anybody else. And in fact, if you think about it, when everyone's students do better, the teachers can work faster with everyone's students. And when everyone, grows up and graduates from high school and goes to college and gets a good job, well, then they're all paying taxes instead of being burdens on society. And in fact, if your neighbor has a house and the value of that house goes up, you know what happens? It actually raises the market value of the houses around it. Yours goes up too. So ultimately, we all do better when we all do better. And addressing things like racism and so forth is something that really benefits all of us. And when we don't address it, it's something that hurts all of us. Now, nobody sees the world the way it is. We all see the world the way that we are, and we're all different. So I'll take just a minute to introduce you a little bit to me and my story so we can have a good discussion today. So my father wasn't Native American at all. He was actually an Austrian Jewish immigrant and a Holocaust survivor. He spoke nothing but German the first 13 years of his life. Eventually, he made his way to the United States and then, came up to Minnesota. He met my mom. Here I am. My mom's Native American. She grew up in a little village called Bena in the middle of the Leech Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota. And that's actually still the area where I live today. I think when my folks were young and getting started in their lives, my father had to hit the restart button from everything that had happened in his early life. And my mother was trying to find a pathway out of poverty. And they had some humble beginnings. But at one point, we had a little one-room house that had kerosene lanterns and an outhouse. And we'd wash up with enamel wash basins in the wintertime. And in the summer, we'd go to the lake or the river to wash up. And it never bothered me. In fact, they remain some very happy memories of my childhood days. But I saw some big changes through the course of my life. By the time I hit middle school, my mother had become the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota and built a nice home. And to me, it revealed the power of an education. Having one is no guarantee that you'll be, rich or successful in the world or anything like that. but it's a lever that improves your chances. And it's one that not everybody gets. I think a lot about these things nowadays. I have a big family. Actually, I have 9 children. And it's been really interesting for me to watch them grow and then navigate the educational system and chart a new path for themselves. Among the things that I saw when I was growing up, my father at one point had put in a bid for a piece of tax forfeited property. He got a letter back from the bank saying, "Your bid is so tiny, it's not even enough to cover the delinquent taxes. Do you have a couple hundred extra dollars?" Which he borrowed. And when he did, he got a pretty good sized chunk of property for relatively little money. And it had been a place that was all wide open farm fields. And he started planting trees there. And in fact, he planted all of the trees in this picture. It completely transformed the landscape and the ecosystem. And that was just one guy. Granted, he had a child labor force, that was me. Um, but when I think about the big problems that all of you are facing, dealing with race relations, climate change, things like that, ultimately, I think where some people might look at those things and go, "There's not a lot I can do about that. I'll try to be a decent human being and I hope it's enough." A lot of times it feels like it's not quite enough. Like all that's necessary for evil to triumph is good people to do nothing or too little. And so we don't have to take this mountain of problems that humans have been making for thousands of years and move the whole mountain today. It's more like we need to keep planting seeds, and it can transform the entire landscape and ecosystem. And that's what a lot of the work is in doing things like addressing race and racism, um, addressing climate change, and helping human beings understand one another and get along better. February is Black History Month. And I think it's really important that we talk about the many, many different stories in Black history. One that really inspires me is the story of Rosa Parks. And when I first heard about this is a story that I'd, heard a version of even as a child. She was, in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, and this is the Jim Crow South. So they had a section of the bus where Black people had to sit, which was separate from where white people sat. And if the bus got crowded, then Black people were asked to give up their seats so that white people could then, in addition to the white section, take over the colored section of the bus. And Rosa Parks was asked to do this. She refused to give up her seat, and it started a big drama in Alabama that eventually culminated in a Black boycott of the busing system, brought a lot of attention and helped pressure for the, addressing the segregation in busing and other parts of society like the schools. So it was a really powerful moment. And I'd heard that story, but there were a lot of things that I didn't know about that story until I got older. Like Rosa Parks, what didn't just refuse to give up her seat, because that's how she was feeling that day. She got on that bus intending not to give up her seat. And there had been a big discussion in the activist community about who should confront the issue. And Rosa Parks volunteered, and the group agreed that it should be her, in part because although she was identifiably Black, she had a lighter complexion than a lot of Black people. And they felt that she would actually have a better chance of a good outcome in the court system if she didn't look too Black. So it was intentional that she was the one who did this, Black enough to challenge the system, to be identified as Black and asked to go to that section of the bus, but not so Black that her case would just be dismissed outright. That was really fascinating. And also part of, the sad statement about the racial climate in the American South at the time. I also didn't know at that point in time, when I first heard the story, that afterwards, Rosa Parks and other members of her family received death threats for years, and that Rosa Parks was fired from her job in response to doing that. She eventually moved to Detroit and she went on with her life, but it was a really remarkable piece of history. So now that we're in February, and it's Black History Month, I really encourage you all to think about the many, many important Black leaders and success stories and voices that have shaped and continue to shape the country that we all live in. Also, it's a great time to reflect on what kinds of change we really want to see in society. And there are so many amazing human beings who have done so many amazing things to address all of the disparities and inequities in our country. I've been really amazed with some of the indigenous language activists, like in Hawaii, only 30 years ago, it was illegal for uh, for people to use the Hawaiian language in schools. And today, Hawaiian is one of the official languages for the whole state of Hawaii. And there are 22 schools that only teach in Hawaiian, and they've grown the population of fluent speakers there 23-fold. So it's been a pretty amazing success story in language revitalization. And I think that that's not just good for the Hawaiians, it says something positive about our country if for everyone, if our country can actually support that kind of growth and healing. We're trying to do this in the Ojibwe world too, and in many other places. There are some really exciting stories about people making a difference in all kinds of areas. I think also when you think about the experiences that people of color have often had in America, I think there's an awareness that there have been lots of problems and mistreatments. And I think there's a growing awareness that there are still some terrible inequities going on in our country. And, you know, coming up in just a couple of months for you will be the trial of Derek Chauvin, the police officer who kneeled on the neck of George Floyd, killing him. And I think our state and area is going to, really be facing these issues in a different way. And I just want to encourage you all to, pay attention to the stories and pay attention to what happens with our justice system as that unfolds. And at the same time that we look at these kind of tough chapters, there's a old proverb that one of my elders liked to recite once in a while. And it says that every time they tried to bury us, they didn't realize that we were the seeds. And so, one of the lessons that's important to remember about Black history, Indigenous history, Latinx history is that we are more than the sum of our tragedies. And it's not just the bad things that have happened that have impacted us in the past or in the present, the good things do too. And in spite of human beings being pretty hard on each other for a really long time, there are many, many people from these communities who are thriving and doing amazing things and making the world better, not just for their, communities, but for the entire country and for all of us. I think too, even in my hometown of Bemidji, Minnesota, northern Minnesota, we have um, the cop cars all display like Ojibwe language signage, Ganawain Jigang Minoa Na Damaging, to protect and serve. And although that doesn't fix any of the big problems, it makes a little safe space where we can then talk about the big problems. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do more of that. There's a really great quote by an Australian Aboriginal woman named Lila Watson. And she said, If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is tied up with mine, then let us work together. And I just thought that was so profound. When you think about it, things like racism actually dehumanize all of us. They reduce everyone's humanity. And yes, if someone's a victim, of a racial incident, for example, it's a lot worse being the victim than the perpetrator, but it diminishes the perpetrator too. And ultimately, that these things are still issues um, makes it harder for everyone. And we really should be able to be judged by the content of our character, rather than the color of our skins. And we've still got a ways to go to make that happen. I really appreciate all of you for leaning in to the discussions and the learning that will be happening this week. And I have some questions for you to help you guide your discussions. So as the, you know, teachers proceed, you can just pause this video at any time and open up the discussion with your students. And for students, you can lean into these conversations in class with one another, with your teachers. And I hope it'll spark some really good communication and conversation. So back to the analogy I was giving, with the finger, seeing that as a finger, the number one and up. One question I have is, how can we get more information from perspectives different from our own? And so that's a question that I'd like to ask you to answer for yourselves and in discussion with one another. How can we get more information from perspectives different from our own? A follow-up question to that: who benefits when we do that? I've got another series of questions related to the quote, which actually comes from Paul Wellstone, former senator from Minnesota, who said, "We all do better when we all do better." One of the questions I have for you is, what does this mean to you? We all do better when we all do better. Another, if other people do better, won't that mean fewer jobs or opportunities for me? Another one, what gets in the way for other people doing better? And a follow-up to that, do we all have equal opportunities? Why or why not? And are disadvantages distributed equally in our society? I also have a series of questions related to the analogy that I gave you with my father's experience turning farm fields into a big towering forest. And I said, it's a good analogy for making change in the world, planting seeds and growing change. And so I'm interested in your reactions to that statement. All we need to do is plant the seeds. The first question is, what does that mean to you? Also, how can we change the racial environment in America? And to look inside ourselves, I'd like you all to think about this one too. What is my personal responsibility to address racism? Ask that question of yourself. What is my personal responsibility to address racism? And the world is a diverse place, and so is our community. How can I be better prepared for that? And then, in reaction to the Lila Watson quote, if you have come because your liberation is tied up with mine, then let us work together. And so I've got a couple questions for you on that. One is, how does racism dehumanize all of us? Another, Rosa Parks, civil rights leaders, Indigenous language advocates, all give us examples of how to make positive change. What kinds of change do you want to see? And what are you going to do to make a positive difference in the world? I hope you have a great discussion today and throughout the rest of the week and the month. Happy Black History Month. Thank you so much.